9. Cardinal Spellman High School was a good hour's ride from the Bronxdale houses, assuming the trains and buses were running on time. The school building was divided right down the middle by a crack in the wall, girls on one side and boys on the other. On each floor, a nun stood guard at the crack to make sure that neither sex crossed over into the other side without a teacher's permission slip. The nuns were Sisters of Charity, the same at Blessed Sacrament. By the time I entered high school in 1968, many had shed black bonnets and long black habits, looking a lot less menacing than they used to. Girls and boys were allowed to mix in the lunchroom, but we had separate classes except for religion and a very few upper-level classes, mostly advanced placement or AP. Another exception was freshman Spanish. All the kids who spoke Spanish at home were in one accelerated class taught by a nun recently arrived from Spain. It was her plan, she told us, to condense 3 years of high school Spanish into 1 month of review and then to start teaching us literature. We were only a week into this semester when the classroom was on the verge of a mutiny. A desperate mob surrounded Eddie, Irizarry, and me, the two biggest mouths, asking to plead the class's case. Tell her we aren't Spanish, we're American. 45 minutes and nobody understood a word she said. Our teacher was totally unaware that Puerto Rican kids raised in the Bronx would have no formal instruction in their native language, meaning they could speak it, but they didn't necessarily know how to write it or read it as well as they spoke it. As for the acquired tongue, many of us had struggled in our early years through a sink or swim transmission in schools that provided no support for kids who first enrolled speaking little or no English. And so I started high school never having studied Spanish grammar, conjugated a verb, or read more than a few sentences at a time, an advertisement or newspaper headline, maybe a very short article. I'd certainly never read a book in Spanish. None of us could understand the teacher's proper Castilian accent or her elegant diction. We looked on blankly, unable to follow her instructions, let alone do the assignments. My Spanish was so deficient that I wasn't even pronouncing my own name properly. She called on me. You have the most regal of Spanish names, she says. Don't you ever let anybody mispronounce it. You are Sonia, Sotomayor, Sotomayor, and anything else less is disgraceful. Say it correctly and wear it with pride. I could tell that her heart was in the right place. And sure enough, when Eddie and I explained the situation, she was very understanding and accommodating. The very next day, she came back with a gentle apology and a new plan that was much more realistic. We would still go twice as fast as the regular Spanish class, but we'd cover the basics and learn grammar first, then start Spanish literature the second year. It was a good lesson in the value of learning to express your basic needs and trusting you will be heard. Teachers, I was finally realizing, were not the enemy. Not most of them anyways. There was a geometry teacher named Rigor Mortis. Word had it she'd been at Cardinal Spellman since before the invention of the triangle, standing before eons of the freshman classes like a prehistoric scarecrow, skinny and wrinkled with a bright thatch of red hair. I was shocked when she called me into her office and accused me of cheating. The basis for her accusation was my perfect score on the Regents geometry exam. No one in all her centuries of experience had ever scored 100 on the Regents New York State standardized test. So who did I cheat from? I asked indignantly. Who else got 100 that I could have copied from? That's why I really like Sonia Sotomayor. She is a very strong, even as a young girl. She looked flummoxed for a moment. But you've never scored higher than 80s or low 90s on the practice test. How could you get 100? The truth, as I explained, was I had never once gotten an answer wrong in the practice test. Points had been deducted only because I hadn't followed the steps she had prescribed. I had reasoned out my own steps, which made sense to me, and she never had explained what was wrong with them. On the Regents exams, we only had to give the answer. No one was checking the steps. What happened next truly amazed me. She dug out my old tests and reviewed them. Acknowledging the validity of my proofs, she changed my grades. Even rigor mortis, it turned out, wasn't quite as rigid as all that. Perhaps the most improbable turn of events in those first months, my cousin Miriam and I signed up to be Maritime Cadets, a neighborhood after-school program. On Friday night, we went to PS 75 at Hunts Point and marched around the gym. We wore uniforms, we memorized nautical terms, that's like the sea, like the ocean, and learned how to tie knots. We would never actually set foot on a boat, but we did march in the Puerto Rican Day Parade. Our ulterior motive for joining the cadets was to chaperone her brother Nelson, who played trumpet in their marching band. Nelson, my childhood accomplice, my genius sidekick, had grown into a girl magnet. He was incredibly handsome, as smart as ever, with a wicked sense of humor. He'd also become an impressively talented musician. In fact, he was desperate to pursue this love, even though Tio Benny had always wanted him to be a doctor. He'd only agreed to let Nelson join the marching band because he thought the discipline was good for him and it would keep him off the street. The seductions of girls and music weren't the only reasons Tio Benny felt someone had to keep an eye on Nelson. Nelson had started at Bronx High School of Science the same year I entered Cardinal Spellman, and already he was struggling. There was no question of his scientific aptitude or intelligence. By the time he got to high school, he'd won several prestigious awards for his science fair projects, and his teachers had recognized him as a prodigy, equally talented at science and music. No, Nelson's real difficulties were not intellectual but emotional. Tio Benny and Tito Carmen were breaking up. I couldn't imagine what the split was doing to Nelson, Miriam, and little Eddie too, especially Nelson. When we were little, Miriam always found 1,000 reasons to say no to any new game or plan that I suggested. Eventually, she would agree, but it was such an effort cajoling her. We would have a lot of fun together in high school, but she'd been one prissy little kid growing up. Nelson, on the other hand, never said no to me. He was game for anything, sticking his neck out for a friend without thinking twice. Those were the qualities I loved in him, and when we were little, but those same qualities would leave him vulnerable to the worst temptations, especially in a neighborhood that was drowning in drugs. Sometimes when I watched Nelson practice for the band, I'd imagine him standing on the bow of a boat, blowing his trumpet with all of his heart, only for that boat to drift slowly out to sea and leave me standing on the dock. So I like the use of her figurative language because I think it's like foreshadowing something might happen to Nelson. The summer vacation between freshman and sophomore year, I was working my way through the summer reading list when Lord of the Flies brought me to a halt. I wasn't ready to start another book when I finished that one. I'd never read anything so layered with meaning. It haunted me, and I needed to think about it some more. But I didn't want to spend the whole break doing nothing but reading and watching TV. Junior was happy shooting baskets all the daylight hours, but there wasn't much else going around the projects if you were too old for the playground and not into drugs. Orchard Beach still beckoned, roasting traffic and all, but getting there was a trek you couldn't make every day. So I decided to get a job. Mammy and Titi Karma were sitting in Abuelita's kitchen over coffee when I announced my plan. There were no shops and businesses in the projects, but maybe I could find someone to hire me in Abuelita's old neighborhood. Tita Carmen still lived on Southern Boulevard and worked nearby at United Bargains. The mom and pop stores under the L wouldn't hire kids, leaning on family labor rather than paying a stranger. But the bigger retailers along Southern Boulevard might. I proposed to walk down the street and inquire in each one. Don't do that, said Titi Carmen. Let me ask Angie. Angie was Titi Carmen's boss. My mother, meanwhile, looked stricken and bit her lip. She didn't say anything until Titi had gone. Then for the first time, she told me a little bit about her own childhood, about sewing and ironing handkerchiefs for Titi Aurora since before she could remember for hours every day. I resented it, Sonia. I don't want you to grow up feeling like I did. She went on to apologize for being unable to buy us more things, but still insisted it would be even worse if I blamed her one day of depriving me of a childhood. I hadn't seen that coming. Nobody was forcing me to work. Sure, a little pocket money would be nice, but that wasn't the main motivation. Mammy, I want to work, I told her. She'd worked too hard all her life to appreciate that leisure can mean boredom, but that was what I knew I'd be facing if I sat at home all summer. I promised never to blame her, and in that moment I began to understand how hard my mother's life had been. Titi Carmen reported back that Angie was willing to hire me for $1 an hour. That was less than minimum wage, but since I really wasn't old enough to work legally, they would just pay me off the books. I would take the bus, meet Titi Carmen at her place, and then we'd walk over to United Bargains together. That became the routine. I was in a neighborhood where you walked alone. United Bargains sold women's clothes. I pitched in whenever needed, restocking, tidying up, monitoring the dressing rooms. I was supposed to watch for the telltale signs of a shoplifter trying to disappear behind the racks, rolling out merchandise to stuff in a purse. I'm on top of page 92. On Saturday nights, the store was open late, and it was dark by the time we rolled down the gates. 2 patrol officers would meet us at the door and escort us home. I don't know how this was arranged, whether it was true that one of the saleswomen was dating one of the cops, but I was glad of it. As we walked along, we could see the SWAT teams on the roof along Southern Boulevard, their silhouettes bulging with body armor, assault rifles bristling. One by one, the shops would darken, and we could hear the clatter of graffiti-covered grates being rolled down, trucks driving off until we were the only ones walking. At T.D. Carmen's, you wouldn't run into any neighbors. I would spend the night there talking the night away with Miriam. I wish Nelson was there too, but he was never home anymore. The next morning in daylight, Southern Boulevard was less threatening. The street vendors were out, shop fronts were open, people were coming and going. On the way home, I stopped at a makeshift fruit cart to buy a banana for a snack. I was standing there peeling my purchase when a police car rolled up to the curb. The cop got out and pointed here and there to what he wanted. There was a language barrier, and the vendor loaded 2 large shopping bags of fruit. The cop made as if to reach for his wallet, but it was only a gesture, and the vendor waved it off. When the cop drove away, I asked the man why he didn't take the money. You'll have to forgive my Spanish. I will try my best. El espacio de hacer negocios. If I don't give the fruit, I can't sell the fruit. My heart sank. I told him I was sorry it was like that. We all have to make a living, he said with a shrug. He looked more ashamed than aggrieved. Why was I so upset? Without the cops, the neighborhood would even be more of a war zone than it was. They worked hard at a dangerous job with little thanks from the people they protected. We needed them. Was I angry because I held the police to a higher standard the same way I did Father Dolan and the nuns? There was something more to it, beyond the trail of trust, beyond the corruption of someone whose uniform was a symbol of the civic order. How do things break down? In Lord of the Flies, the more mature of the Lost Boys starts off with every intention of building a moral, functional society on their island, drawing on what they remember, looking after the little ones, building the shelters, keeping the signal fire burning. Their little community gradually breaks down all the same, battered by those who are far more self-indulgent and those who are driven by ego and fear. Which side was the cop on? The boys needed rules, law, and order to keep their worst instincts in check. The conch they blew to call a meeting or hold for the right to speak stands for order, but it holds no power in itself. Its only power is what they agree to honor. It is a beautiful thing, but fragile. When I was much younger on summer days, I would sometimes go along with Tito Aurora to the place where she worked as a seamstress. Those must have been the days when Mammy was working the day shift, and I, for some reason, couldn't always go to Abuelita's. That room with the sewing machines whirring was a vision of hell to me, steaming hot, dark, and airless, with the windows painted black and the door shut tight. I was too young to be useful, but I tried to help anyways to pass the time. Titi Aurora would give me a box of zippers to untangle, or I'd stack up hangers, sort scraps by color, or fetch things for the women's sewing. All day long I'd keep an eye out for anyone heading towards the door. As soon as it opened, I'd race over and stick my head out for a breath of air until Titi saw me and shooed me back in. I asked her why they wouldn't just keep the door open. They just can't, she would say. Behind the closed door and the blackened windows, all of those women were breaking the law. But they weren't criminals. They were just women toiling long hours under miserable conditions to support their families. They were doing what they had to do to survive. It was my first inkling of what a tough life Titi Aurora had. Titi never got the schooling that Mammy did, and she'd borne the brunt of the father Mammy was spared from knowing. Her married life would have many challenges and few rewards. Work was the only thing she knew to keep going, and she never missed a day. And though Titi was the most honest person I knew, if she found a dime in a payphone, she'd dial the operator to ask where she should mail it. She broke the law every day when she went to work. One evening at United Bargains, the women were making crank calls, dialing random numbers out of the phone book. If a woman's voice answered, they acted as if they were having an affair with the woman's husband, then howled with laughter at the poor girl's response. Titi Carmen would join in, taking a turn on the phone and laughing as long as hard as any of them, and I couldn't understand how anyone could be so cruel, so arbitrarily, pointlessly cruel. What was the pleasure in it? Walking home, I asked her, Titi, can you imagine the pain you're causing in that house? It was just a joke, Sonia. Nobody meant any harm. How could she not imagine? How could the cop not imagine what 2 large shopping bags full of fruit might measure in a poor vendor's life, maybe a whole day's earnings? Was it so hard to see himself in the other man's shoes? I was 15 years old when I understood how it is that things break down. People can't imagine someone else's point of view. That's on page 95, and I think you should underline it. Chapter 10. We have 2 pages to read from this. 3 days before Christmas and midway through my freshman year at Cardinal Spellman High School, we moved to a new apartment in Co-op City. Once again, my mother had led to us what seemed like the edge of nowhere. Co-op City was swampland, home to nothing but a desolate amusement park called Freedom Land until the cement mixers and dump trucks arrived barely a year before we did. We moved into one of the first of 30 buildings planned for development designed to house 55,000. To get home from school, I had to hike a mile down Baychester Avenue, across the freeway overpass, and through the vast construction site of half-built towers and bare bulldozed mud, before reaching human habitation. An icy wind that could lift you off your feet blew from the Hutchinson River. Flurries of snow blurred the construction cranes against the opaque sky of what seemed like Siberia in the Bronx. At least now we lived close enough for me to walk to school, and I was glad of that. The hour-long trek by bus and train from Watson Avenue had been very long. Poor Junior, who was only in sixth grade when we moved, would make the commute in reverse from Co-op City to Blessed Sacrament for another 2.5 years. No one we knew had ever heard of Co-op City. My mother learned about it from some newspaper article on the city's plans for building affordable housing. The cost of living there was pegged to income, and at the same time, you're buying inexpensive shares in a cooperative, so in theory, there was a tax break. My mother was eager to get us into a safer place because the Bronxdale projects were headed downhill fast. Gangs were carving up the territory and each other, adding the threat of gratuitous violence to the scourges of drug and poverty. A plague of arson was spreading through the surrounding neighborhoods as landlords of crumbling buildings chased insurance. Home was starting to look like a war zone. It was Dr. Fisher who made the move possible. When he died, he left my mother $5,000 in his will, the final least expected of the countless kindness that we could never repay, although we tried. When Dr. Fisher was hospitalized after his wife died, Abuelita made Gallego stop on his way to work every morning to pick up Dr. Fisher's laundry and deliver clean pajamas to him. Yes, Co-op City was the end of the earth, but once I saw the apartment, it made sense. It had parquet floors and a big window in the living room with a long view. All the rooms were twice the size of those cubby holes in the projects where we lived, and the kitchen was big enough to sit and eat in. Best of all, my mother's friend Willie, a musician who did handyman work too, was able to partition the master bedroom into two little chambers, each big enough for a twin bed and a tiny bureau, so Junior and I could finally have separate rooms. Each had its own door, and Willie let us each choose our own wallpaper. Junior chose something neutral in a restrained shade of beige. Mine had constellations, planets, and signs of the zodiac in an antique style, as if a Renaissance cartographer had drawn the map for space travel. I was reading a lot of science fiction and fantasizing about travel to the other worlds or slipping through a time warp. It had only been the summer before, in July 1969, that 2 astronauts had walked on the moon, and I was awestruck that it had been in my own lifetime, especially when I remembered that Pappy once had predicted this. And we will stop there.